Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. Now, we're coming very close to interview season here in Oxford, so I'm going to give you my top 5 tips as to how you can improve your performance in interviews so that you feel comfortable in that space, because the whole point of this channel is to give people the tools and the information so that they are empowered and confident in pursuing places at universities like Oxford. So let's dive in. What's the first thing that you should know about Oxford or Cambridge interviews? Well, you, by rights, ought to know why we're using interviews, right? What do we do this for? We're not a place, contrary to popular suspicion, full of psychopaths that like to torture young people by putting them through this horribly grueling process. No, we use interviews because it provides us incredibly useful data on how well set up you are to be taught in our tutorial system. So in Oxford, we teach in very small classes called tutorials. My classes for politics can't be any larger than 3 students, for example. And I want to just get a sense that you would flourish under that sort of environment. And to be fair, the vast majority of people I've ever interviewed have performed incredibly well. So it's very unlikely that you would perform badly at interview. But I will give you some information as to what tends to stand out, what sorts of things I tend to look for, and specifically the sorts of data that we collect. So typically the sorts of data that we will be gathering, so while we are interviewing you, we will be making notes on your performance, and we will quantify your performance typically relative to other interviewees. And some of the data we might collect would conform to what I call the 3 C's, which are with regards to clarity, in other words, how clearly you communicate your ideas, coherence, which is the extent to which you can build together ideas and you can fit them into a whole argument, as opposed to just throwing out lots and lots of different ideas without them necessarily coming together. And the 3rd C is critical thinking, the extent to which you can evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different ideas before coming to a particularly clear conclusion. So those 3 C's form the basis of a lot of the data that we will be gathering. The format by which those data are collected for different interviews will differ, and different colleges will take different data, but those 3's are a good predictor of the sorts of things that you will likely be judged upon. Okay, and I'll give you some examples very shortly as to how this can actually work out. The 4 key words, so we're doing sort of 3, 4, 5 here, the 4 key words to think about are what do you think? One of the most important things in an Oxford interview is to get a sense that you are capable of independent thought, that you can think for yourself, that you can solve problems. This includes in subjects like maths and chemistry, where there may be a right answer to a puzzle that you're given in an interview, but there'll be multiple ways you can reach that right answer. And so what do you think becomes super important. Okay, and 5-year-olds will be particularly good in an Oxford interview. Now this might sound quite surprising, but this is because, as I've discussed in previous videos, we're looking for people that are open-minded, flexible in their thinking, and crucially very curious. They're keen to learn. And 5-year-olds are immensely good at that. Indeed, if you want to sort of picture in your mind what it's like being in an Oxford interview, it's like sitting down with a 5-year-old. So, you know, if you've got younger siblings or cousins around that age, or if you remember being that age yourself, you might recall asking things like, why is the sky blue? And why is gold yellow when most other metals are silver? Those sorts of stretching, interesting questions that 5-year-olds are so good at asking. Well, the Oxford interviewer is going to be exactly like that. They're going to be like a 5-year-old. And when you answer their brain-stretching questions, they will just shoot back with follow-up questions based off of what you've said, okay? So it's not scary, the Oxford interview. It's not supposed to be scary. We don't want it to be scary, but it's a bit like sitting down with a 5-year-old and having a chat about something really, really interesting, okay? So if you view it like that in your mind, you'll do really, really well, okay? So let's dive in with a particular example, just so that this becomes a little bit clearer. Here's an example from Earth Sciences, which is one of the degrees we have here in Oxford. And the example is, or the question is, how can you define life? So how can you define life? Remember those 4 key words. What do you think? It's not how can us as a society define life, it's how can you define life, okay? And that's exactly the sort of question that my 6-year-old son might ask, right? You know, how can you define life? And you're just stumped going, you know, it's really difficult. And when I start to answer my son, he'll shoot back with, what do you mean by define? I don't understand. You know, what's life? You know, he'll shoot back with follow-up questions. So it's exactly what an Oxford interview is like, okay? So, you know, maybe pause the video, have a think about how you might define life, what sort of criteria you would use. And imagine a bit of a back and forth between you and the interviewer to try and get to the heart of what you're trying to say. And in the midst of that, remember the 3 C's. So are you clear? Is it easy to comprehend what you're trying to say? You're not just sort of going on and saying things that are not necessarily relevant to this question. Relatedly, are you coherent? Are you pulling ideas together to come up with a full definition of life as you see it? Or are you just throwing ideas out at random to see what sticks? And thirdly, are you able to think critically? Are you able to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of different definitions for life? Okay, so remember the 3 C's, the 4 magic words, and thinking like a 5-year-old. 3, 4, 5 is the way to go through Oxford interviews. Now, how and when, the format and timings. So interviews are in Oxford are typically in early December. You'll receive invites in late November. If you haven't heard from your college, then you can contact them if you're in any way uncertain of what's going on. The interviews are entirely academic in content. There may be a little bit of small talk at the start along the lines of, hello, how are you? But then it will blast into, how do you define life, right? So within seconds, you'll be going into very rich academic terrain quickly, if terrain can be rich. Never mind. So it's going to be very academic. It's not going to be the sorts of interviews that you might have for a job where they might ask you, why have you decided to apply to this college? Or, tell me something about your at standard day. We're not interested in that sort of stuff. We're not going to take data on that because we're ultimately only judging you on your academic ability and potential. So you don't need to prepare for anything outside of that. You may be asked things about what you wrote in your personal statement for the UCAS form. So just make sure that you are clear as to what you did write in the personal statement. If you are asked any questions about that, it will be about any personal statements you made. In other words, any bits where you said, I would argue this or I think the other, that's the sort of stuff that you might be asked about from your personal statement. I can't guarantee that you will be asked about your personal statement. It varies a lot from college to college and from course to course, but it's a good idea to just make sure you remember what you wrote in your personal statement. What the academics are not going to do is just test your knowledge. In other words, they're not going to say, well, you claim to have read this book, so what did the author say on page 39, right? They're not going to do that. Okay, the interviews for Oxford are entirely online. For Cambridge, they are mostly online, with the exception of one college, I think. So because it's online, they may include some virtual whiteboards, such as Miro. You'll be told all of these instructions and you'll be asked about what devices you have available and all the rest of it. So don't worry too much about that. But if you have any questions, you should contact your college. Okay. Typically, the interviews are up to about 30 minutes. They can be shorter, they can be longer. You can be called to multiple interviews. I've given a range of between 1 and 6, but more likely is that you'll be invited to about 2 or 3 interviews. You can be reallocated to different colleges during the admissions process. Don't read anything into that. It can be as a consequence of various different scenarios. It could be that you are doing really well and multiple colleges want to see you. It could be that there's just not space for you at one particular college. So just don't read anything into it. It's not possible to interpret it at the time. Okay, so here's an example from economics. Now, one thing that's not unusual is that you're given pre-reading or you're given some resource to look at before the interview. And here's an example from economics. Now, at first glance, this is a lot to get your head around, but you would have about half an hour for any pre-reading. And so it should be enough time to get your bearings in a complex sort of document like this. Incidentally, if you are entitled to extra time at school as a consequence of learning differences such as, say, dyslexia, then you'd be entitled to that same extended time in an Oxford interview. So you must just make sure that someone knows that and that you get what you need. Okay. Now, what we've got here, and I'm going to have to wear my glasses because I'm half blind, is we've got some graphs that describe differences between GDP per capita. Now, GDP is gross domestic product. Now, if you didn't happen to know what GDP was, you can absolutely ask the tutors in the interview. So it's not a test of knowledge, it's a test of how you think in an interview. So if you don't know something, don't panic. It's not required. Anyway, we've got GDP per capita, which is the red line. We've got production-based CO2 per capita. So that's how much CO2 is emitted by a country when they produce goods and services. And then we've got consumption-based CO2 per capita, which is how much CO2 is emitted by a country based on how much it consumes goods and services from around the world. And so what you would typically be asked to do is to start off by just explaining that you understand what you're seeing here. So just a comprehension question. So what do you think these graphs are telling us would be an opening question. And you don't need to have all of the details down, but just giving a sense that you have been able to read and understand the graphs in basic terms is absolutely fine. The tutors will help you because remember what we're doing is we're trying to recreate the way we teach in Oxford in these small classes. So it's very much a teaching moment. So you are working with a tutor. You're not there to just show off how knowledgeable you are without any help from the tutors, and they will help you. Okay, so just see it as you're as if you're having a lesson, right? Because it's almost literally exactly what is going on. So the interviewers will ask, what do you see? What's going on here? And so you might say something like, well, okay, well, over time, over the last 30 years, from 1990 to 2021, we can see that there is a split, a divergence between the amount at which people are getting richer, GDP per capita is going up, whilst consumption of carbon dioxide, emission of carbon dioxide through consumption or production has been going down. So there's a sort of divergence. And in different countries, that rate of divergence is variable. And in some places like Finland, there's a bit more noise in the data, a bit more up and down rather than sort of smooth trends. In America, you may notice that they've had amongst the highest rates of GDP growth, but relatively low cuts in CO2, although Sweden has also had quite high rates of growth, but also much faster rates of cutting their CO2 emissions. So you can see some interesting patterns going on, but the patterns seem to be similar amongst these 6 rich countries. Okay, so that would be the first question, just sort of tell us what's going on in these graphs. And then we would get into the weeds of it, and then, you know, the 3 C's, clarity, coherence, critical thinking will come out. The 4 magic words, what do you think? And thinking like a 5-year-old. So we might ask you things like, well, what do these charts tell us about the relationship between CO2 emissions and economic growth? And you might sort of suggest, well, there's been a split, that it's no longer the case that in order to become richer, you need to emit CO2. Indeed, countries are becoming richer despite cutting their emissions. But you can dig into some of the details. We might sort of ask you to specifically focus on bits of the graph that we think are interesting. So for most of the countries, there's this little spike where things drop suddenly around 2008. Now, you may be aware that that coincides with a global financial crisis. You don't need to know that. Remember, these interviews are not testing your knowledge, okay? We are testing your thinking skills. So we will tell you that there was a global financial crisis in 2008, and we will ask you to explain why there might be this sort of bump in the data. And it'll be up to you to tell us what you think, okay? So moving on, what are interviews not about? They are not effectively a boss level, by which I mean you haven't sort of progressed it through all of the stages of the admissions process for Oxford, only to sort of encounter me, the big bad boss, who is sort of the only thing between you and a place at the university, okay? What we do is we take all of the data that we have about your application and we consider it holistically. So we don't just sort of say the interview is the only thing that matters once you reach that stage. We look at everything. So that means you might have a relatively poor interview performance, as in relative to other interviewees, but because of strengths elsewhere in your application, we would still admit you. Okay, so be very clear on that. It's also not crucially a test of you or your character or, you know, your accent or, you know, the clothes you wear. So just dress comfortably, be yourself. Don't try and pretend to be someone that you're not. I mean, it would be devastating to think that someone might assume we were prejudiced in those ways, but I can tell you that we have lots of safeguards in place to ensure that that sort of stuff does not count against you in the interview. Okay, so just try and relax as far as possible, be yourself. At the same time, you don't need to be super confident. We're aware that people may be very nervous, and that's completely normal. It's nothing to worry about. You know, you don't need to worry about being worried because it's normal. In fact, the interviewers are quite often a little bit anxious because they want to get the best performance out of the interviewees. So I'm always quite nervous when I'm interviewing. But, you know, just try and relax, try and be yourself. If you are neurodiverse, let's say you've got autism or some other learning difference, again, not to worry, we're just judging you on your academic ability and potential. And so if you're a bit nervous in social situations, that's fine. It's not something that's going to be held against you. Okay, so let's have a look at another example. So this is for engineering. So for engineering, and this is a case where you might be asked to use an online whiteboard, you could be asked, please draw the force diagram for a plane in flight. Please draw the force diagram for a plane in flight. So if you're planning to take engineering or physics, maybe pause the video here and see if you could give it a go without too much help, and we'll see what you come up with. So a force diagram would look a little bit like this. And now this does kind of test your knowledge, but it's the sort of thing that you could reasonably be expected to know after 1 year of high school physics or mathematics. And so from this, we would then start to gauge what you think. So we'd still sort of ask you to develop your thinking skills, because what we might do is ask you to then assess what could happen if the plane was flying in rain. How would that change the forces? And so you would probably work out that there would be a bit more weight on the plane because the air is going to be more dense. If it's literally flying through rain and rain is falling on the plane, then there's going to be a little bit of weight added, but it's not going to be much given that we're talking about a very, very heavy aircraft. But still, a bit of rain. We would then start introducing some new ideas for you to see how you integrate them with your thinking. So we might tell you, for example, that rain can interfere with the lift, so the way that water flows over the wing can affect the airflow, and that can affect lift. There can be more drag as a consequence of the rain. And so that could be interesting to factor in, and we'd ask you, what do you think about that? How do you think that changes the forces, okay? And then we might point out something quite interesting, which is the effects of rain on the jet engine. So we might sort of say, what do you suppose could happen if you have very wet air that is going into a chamber that's basically got loads of explosions going on, right? A jet engine is just exploding fuel and air mixture in order to generate thrust. So what happens if a lot of that air is incredibly wet? Well, we would again tell you, we would sort of teach you what's likely to be going on. So this again is a point to remember that you are in a teaching moment in the interview. So you're not expected to know all of this stuff. You're expected to sort of react to it and see how you go with it. So make sure you listen very carefully to the interviewers. Make sure you retain a high degree of focus and precision on what they're telling you. So they might tell you, for example, that the rain will have a negligible effect on the temperature in the jet engine, because the jet engine is so hot that the rain will basically be vaporized immediately. So it doesn't sort of cause any trouble to the engine, obviously, otherwise planes would fall out of the sky whenever it rains. So thank goodness it's fine. But it also, in fact, can help the engine be more efficient because it ever so slightly cools it down through this vaporization process. Also, because the air is more dense typically when it's raining, there's basically more matter being thrust out of the back of the engine, which can help the engine run more efficiently as well and give it more thrust and more power. So rain, interestingly, can improve the performance of jet engines. So despite some of the impact from drag and from weight as a consequence of rain, you could get better performance out of the engine, which is interesting. And we would ask you, what do you think about that? Okay, so remember those magic 4 words. Right, so what is the next thing to be aware of for Oxbridge interviews? Well, we've told you what they're not. They're not testing you. We're not testing how you look, how you sound, any of that sort of stuff. We're not testing how confident you are as a person. We are just testing your academic ability and your academic potential, okay? And we're also sort of gauging how motivated you are. Are you up for this? These degrees are pretty intensive on occasions, and there will be a lot of times when you might have to work on your own. And are you ready for that? Are you sort of keen for the challenge? And, that's something that you can't really fake. You can't sort of paint on a smile and go, oh, so excited to study this subject with you. So it will more just be a sense of, authentically, do you give us the sense that you are interested in what we're talking about, okay? And so if you try and stay relaxed and you try and have as much fun as possible, then you'll be on to the right thing, okay? Don't sort of try and force yourself to be having as much fun as possible. But if you just give us a sense that you're the sort of person that will get out of bed on a rainy morning and go to those 9 a.m. lectures, then that is pretty reassuring. So let me give you an example from English literature. Okay, here we've got a poem. Again, you would be given this poem in advance of the interview, usually about half an hour beforehand, so that you could read and think about it. This is a poem by an author that is not terribly well known. It's called Eugenio Montale. He's an Italian poet, and this is a translation. Now, it's deliberate that we've chosen a poem that is not terribly well known because we want to get a sense of what you think. And this is how we could test your motivation, right? We show you an unseen bit of poetry, and we say, look, you're going to be dealing with unfamiliar materials day in and day out. Are you going to be up for this? The minute I show you something new, you're not going to recoil from that challenge. You're going to be up for it. That's good. If you sort of see something new and you go, oh, this is unfamiliar, I don't like it, and you don't give us a sense that you're interested, then that's going to be problematic. That's a bit of a red flag that you just won't enjoy the degree. Anyway, let me sort of read some of this. So I'll read the first stanza. Don't ask us for the word to square our shapeless spirit on all sides and proclaim it in letters of fire to shine like a lost crocus in a dusty field. Oh, interesting. Okay, so I won't read the rest of the poem, but do feel free to do so if you want to. So again, the opening questions in an interview around this would be along the lines of, what do you think the poem says? So we'll start with comprehension questions, and then we'll dive quite quickly into what do you think about the poem? What do you think the message is? And then we might get into some of the technical aspects, so some of the language or some of the poetic form that is used. So for example, there's a bit of enjambment going on here where a sentence crosses over multiple lines, and we'll ask you why you think the author is doing that. We might ask you about use of imagery. So for example, it says the word in the opening line, which could be a reference to something biblical. So we will sort of ask you for your views, right? There's not particularly a right answer that we're grasping for here. We're just trying to get a sense of, are you capable of independent-minded literary criticism? Are you clear? First C. Are you coherent in what you say? Now, be careful with coherence. What I'm not saying is that you have to say everything and have it all completely knit together, right? You can change your mind if you come up with an idea and you want to go back on it. That's absolutely fine. But tell us why you've changed your mind, okay? What I mean by coherence is that you're not just throwing out loads and loads of ideas and just raining down different solutions, but you're coming up with a bit of a set of solutions that come together, so it's clear what you're trying to say. And the third C, remember, is critical thinking. So if I propose an alternative to your ideas, I want to see how you deal with that, whether you can evaluate your own line of thinking. Okay? Now, 5 is a good interview. So what sort of things stand out to me? Well, we've already mentioned over and over again that we want you to be clear, precise, and open-minded. Now, the most common mistake I've encountered in Oxford interviews is people not answering my questions. So make sure you listen very carefully to the interviewer. It is a dialogue, it's not a monologue, okay? Try not to talk and talk and talk so that the interviewer can't come back and help you develop your line of thinking, okay? They are there to help you. They are your friend, they're not your enemy. So you've got to listen very carefully to what they're saying, and you've got to work with them, okay? It's also important to, if you want to stand out, to be prepared to think outside the box. Now, this is not something that you need to do unilaterally. Remember, this is a teaching moment, this is a conversation, but we might take you outside of normal intuition, we might pull you outside of the intellectual box, as it were, and we just want to see how you cope with that, because that can happen in tutorials all the time. So let me give you an example, just to make this a bit more clear. This is an example from medicine, and the question is, we have one heart but two kidneys. Why is that? We have one heart but two kidneys. Now, the fundamental answer to this, which we would get to fairly quickly, is because of surface area. That because kidneys, like lungs, are dealing with fluid exchange, having two of them increases the surface area relative to the volume. So it just means that we get a lot more surface area, and it's really helpful. We don't have two kidneys so that one is a spare, because otherwise we might well have two hearts and two pancreases and two livers and so on. So that's not why we have two kidneys, we have it because of surface area. So that's the sort of the basic level answer. But then the interviewers might try and sort of develop that into something that's a bit more outside the box. So they might, for example, say, well, do we in fact have one heart? No, okay. Now this is a slightly odd question, and this is very much the sort of question that a 5-year-old would ask. You know, because if you look at this image of a heart, it doesn't look like one thing at all. It looks like loads of things. You know, a heart, as you may be aware, is at least 4 chambers with lots of blood vessels coming in and out of it. So to describe it as one thing feels like a function of language rather than reality. And so it could be that we're duping ourselves by saying it's one thing. Now, I wouldn't expect you to come up with that line of thought, but I would be expected to see how you react to it and tell us what you think and see how that develops your line of thinking. Okay, so be prepared to go there and go to places which could be a bit surprising. Okay, so how should you prepare for interviews? Well, I'll link in the description the playlist of videos that we have on Oxford interviews, so hopefully that will be of some help. But be prepared to think out loud. Remember, this is a teaching moment in Oxford interviews, so we need to hear your thought processes. And you can do that in front of a mirror, you can do that with your pet as you're sort of, taking a dog for a walk, you can do that with friends and family. You do not, in other words, need to have lots of mock interviews with subject experts. Far more useful is just getting used to trying to solve these knotty problems by thinking out loud. Okay, so try and read, watch and listen to things around your subject, stretch yourself, come across some interesting ideas, push yourself outside of those intellectual boxes, work through some complicated puzzles, many of which I've given examples for here on this YouTube channel. Aim to be a think-it-all rather than a know-it-all. The interviews are not going to be testing stuff that you know. It's quite all right to use examples of stuff that you know if it's relevant to a question you've been asked. But what many people think is that the interview is your opportunity to show off how much stuff you know and to just tell us at length all of these facts. Actually, we're trying to solve puzzles, we're trying to think things through. So listen very carefully to our questions, respond very accurately to them. And don't just try and dump loads of knowledge on us. Try and think very carefully about how you would solve some of these puzzles. Okay, as I say, I've got loads of other examples on the channel about how you can do this and sorts of questions that come up. I will be producing some more videos like this as we run up to interview season, because I want you to feel as comfortable and as confident in the interview process as I can. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I wish you all the best. Bye now. Cheers. Bye.